Okay, thank you so much for coming in out of the sunshine. Thank you doubly much if you have been here since 10:45 this morning, or if you've joined us for later in the day. We're truly grateful. We are interrogating quite an important issue about whether we think democracy is savable. So I want to try to inject some level of hope into this panel, and I'm reliant upon my very lovely panel of speakers. So let me quickly introduce, I forgot to say, I'm Joan Concannon. I'm director of York Festival of Ideas. But let me now turn to my very distinguished panel, some of whom are frequent flyers at the York Festival of Ideas, some of whom are returners, and some of whom are new, but hopefully to come back again. So on my immediate, my left, is Alexander Hurst, who is a Paris-based writer, editor, and columnist at The Guardian, and very unfortunately for him, wrote an amazing article as we were pulling together the cast list of speakers about technology, intergenerational polarization, and other such topics that made me think I needed him to come back again, because this is his second year on similar panels. A newbie is Dr. Patrick J. Houlihan, who is an associate professor in history at Trinity College, Dublin, where he's also an elected fellow, and his research interests include war and ideology in European and global history. But I guess I was particularly interested in Patrick's vast expertise in the interrelationship between the Vatican morality and interesting current foreign policy choices of the current Pope. My very lovely colleague, Professor Kate Pickett, who has a new job title, and it will become very apparent why this is a very strategic choice by the University of York. Kate is now the first ever professor for the public understanding of social sciences, and I feel sure that it will be very evident by the end of our session as to why we made that strategic choice. She is the author of The Inner Level, The Spirit Level, and most recently, a fantastic manifesto for change called The Good Society. And then very finally, I have got excellent value from the Esler household this weekend, fresh from interviewing Nicola Sturgeon last night and chairing an earlier session. I wanted to bring in Gavin Esler's very interesting global political experience, and particularly around issues of leadership, and also how we as individuals can participate and regain some agency. So without further ado, I'm going to kick off. We're segueing very beautifully from the last panel. We're going to start with Alexander and his views. They're each going to speak for a strict 7 minutes and no more, or I will get very cross. And then we're going to immediately throw it out to all of you. And at the end, you're going to be asked to make a very important decision, as you are our citizens' jury. Alexander.
Hello. So I'm going to speak a bit about proximity and democracy, because I think some of the challenges that we're seeing in modern democracies stem from, or at least linked to, the ways in which we no longer really are in proximity with each other or with the institutions that are supposed to represent us. So I'll start with the moment of proximity. Years ago, pre-COVID, I was having lunch with my friend Guillaume in a brasserie, and we started talking about community, because he was saying that he was afraid for the future of French politics because France no longer felt like a community to him. And so we were starting to agree on a definition of community, and we arrived at a web of relationships that are non-transactional in nature. And that was pretty easy for me to agree to, because I grew up kind of among all of that. I grew up amidst a very atypical community of anti-capitalist Catholics who all moved to the same inner city neighborhood in Cleveland, Ohio, and decided to work on social justice activism and issues there in Cleveland. And since we're on the topic of my childhood, that was atypical, but here's something that maybe everybody can relate to, a sound from my childhood, though I'm probably the last generation to have a personal link with this sound, so very briefly. And that's just to remind us that there was a time when we connected to and disconnected from the internet. And when I think back to not really my childhood, but sort of young adulthood, I think technology took a really wrong turn that took it from a place where it was pretty much a net benefit socially and individually in terms of consumer technology to a place that was a net negative socially and individually. And that's when the constant connectivity that is impossible for all of us to sort of get away from 2010 to about 2014, so around the time that I left the US and moved to France, we had the arrival of the algorithm that started determining all the content and information that was being fed to people and sort of pushed upon them as soon as you connected to any type of social media app. And we had this switch where not even that we're the product, we went from being users of technology to being a resource to be mined and extracted from for our data. And I think the results of those two shifts are pretty clear. We have teenagers today spend between 8 and 9 hours on average on a screen every day. The number of 15 to 29-year-olds in the US spend 45% more time alone than they did 15 years ago. Over half of men in the United States, especially young men, say no one really knows them. No one. And so we've got this place where individuals are disconnected from each other, existing in an economy that has become really disconnected from the actual real world and its impacts on the real world. And the UK has a housing cost crisis. Housing prices are up, combined rent, mortgage 41% in the last 5 years is the data that I saw when I was researching this. In the EU, rent is up 25% in the past 10 years, mortgages up 50% in cost over the last 10 years. And that's certainly a crisis that's hitting the United States as well. And so then we have this economy that's become unaffordable for most people, that's also producing insane levels of inequality. And we all know the story about inequality, how much it's rising everywhere, but just to kind of, keep our hands on what this actually looks like, because the numbers are kind of hard to wrap our heads around. 1 million seconds is 12 days. 1 billion seconds is 32 years. And so if we look at how much money Elon Musk is projected to have once SpaceX IPOs, it's somewhere in excess of the equivalent of 25,000 years if he ends up with anywhere between 800 billion and $1 trillion, right? So one, how is any democracy really compatible with that? But two, you have these disconnected individuals facing a situation where they no longer can project themselves into a community of proximity because they can't afford even the idea of imagining owning a home someday. And so this is pushing people into a type of desperation capitalism, where you have lots of millennials and Gen Z who have concluded that their only way out of an economy that's broken is to try and trade their way out of it. So one more step into an economy that is no longer connected to anything real, and it's trying to trade your way out of it through cryptocurrencies, through stock options, through poly market. And if you listen to the internal conversations in Silicon Valley, a lot of the tech bros are convinced that we're living in sort of the final moments of it being possible to amass some amount of capital, and some point in the near future, the doors will slam shut, and there will be a permanent upper class and a permanent underclass. Silicon Valley takes itself a bit too seriously sometimes, but you can really see the effects of this trickling down into the behavior of all the people who are a resource being mined by the financial firms that are behind Robinhood, crypto scams, other things. And so when I talk about this interesting personal anecdote, during COVID, I was a broke freelance journalist wanting to leave my teeny tiny shared flat in the 14th arrondissement that had no common space. And so I was looking on Reddit and seeing these people trading and thought, if these people on Reddit can trade, certainly me too. So I borrowed a few thousand euros from my bank, spent the next year falling into a rabbit hole of trading obsession, went to over 1.3 million, got very greedy, very full of myself, very impatient to have more and more and more, spent the next 18 months losing all of it. But the whole time I was participating, but also observing this thing that to me, I later dubbed desperation capitalism, and the way that afterwards, after the immediacy of COVID, sort of stuck around with how disconnected people were from each other, from the economy in general, from society in general, a loss of faith in institutions, and in particular what's been dubbed the male loneliness crisis, which is not really about men not getting dates, it's about men not maintaining friendships with each other. And so all of that leads me to a reflection on how do we restore a sense of proximity to each other and to the institutions in democracy. And I want to just look at a few concrete things and then one thing that's more abstract. But given the macro nature of our problems, we need a bit of abstract as well. And so I think the city of Paris, for example, has done a really good job at creating third spaces. So places where you can meet the people around you without an obligation to spend any money, where you can go and dance and listen to music and engage in art, learn something, go to a conference, and you're not being asked to consume in any way. And so the primary way that we're going to get back, I think, to creating webs of non-transactional relationships is by having spaces that require no transaction to occur. Another thing that the city of Paris, and I'm just using Paris because that's where I've been living for the past 11 years, so it's my point of reference. Another thing that Paris has done particularly well, I think, has been putting tons of money into affordable housing. Billions and billions of euros per year being dedicated to creating affordable housing. There's gentrification happening, but at the same time, there are lots of populations that are able to stay in their neighborhoods or able to at least have stable housing situations in otherwise really expensive areas that in other global cities, they would be priced out. We also need, as many speakers were referencing earlier today, some type of, I think, alternative institutions of representation. I would say we can start those at a local level, more so than going immediately to a third assembly at a national level that's like random selection like a jury, but maybe implementing some of these things at a local level is a way to re-engage people in the communities, start to form this network again that supports trust in institutions, understanding of the government, trust in each other as a way to then build on top of in order to do the bigger things that need to be done, like taxing wealth heavily. And the final point is I think that technology bringing us to this point of real disconnection from each other is leading to a backlash. And AI is accelerating all of these trends, and it's condensifying the accumulation of wealth in very few hands, and we all feel that, and we know it. And here, Dex was telling me in the car this morning that the number in the UK is 82% of people are opposed to data centers locally, located near them. In the US, it's 77%, which is remarkable for a country that is borderline on the level of low-intensity civil conflict. And so I would say for me, that's a great starting point for a backlash, is people going out and protesting the data center that big tech wants to locate in their community that is going to gobble up resources, spike electricity prices, generate local ecological harm, and people don't want this. And so it's a concrete thing that I think people are starting to organize around, and maybe there can be a spilling outwards from that to democracy on broader levels.
Thank you so much, Alexander. Patrick, in a largely secular world, what's the moral framework? Is there a moral framework that picks up the threads of what Alexander has just said?
Well, thanks very much for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here. One of the answers is love, and that's what I'm going to talk to you today about, love. And love is a deep, complex idea needing greater action from all of us. This is essential for democracy and for counterbalancing hate and really helping us to build tolerance. So I'm going to give you a short history of humanitarianism in the world wars to the age of AI in 7 minutes. So, I mean, you may be asking yourself, what's love got to do with it? What's love but a secondhand emotion, right? Citing Tina Turner. Love is, as Pope Leo XIV has said, a healthy realism. And that's from the new encyclical. It's at the core of our humanity, and like I said, that counterbalance to hate. And this is in part of history, right? So first point, love has created hope and gotten people through some of the darkest moments of the 20th century. The idea of love your enemy, turn the other cheek, a Christian notion. I mean, this may seem obscene to think about it when the conflict's going on today in Gaza and Ukraine, but love your enemy, turn the other cheek. It's been done before here in Britain and succeeded. I refer to the Save the Children Fund in the years 1919. Save the Children Fund was pioneered by two sisters, Dorothy Buxton and Eglantine Jebb. Jebb was arrested in Trafalgar Square in the spring of 1919. And why was she arrested? Because she was distributing leaflets with pictures of starving German children. But 1919, right? This was before Versailles, before the Germans had signed on the dotted line, right? And so this was seen as defeatist, and Jebb was arrested. Now, she took her case to Pope Benedict XV in the Vatican, and Pope Benedict XV, one of the unknown popes, a comparatively progressive humanitarian and a peacemaker. And Benedict XV took up Jeb's cause and helped globalize what had been a local social movement, to the point where eventually Save the Children Fund took off, and the Russian famine, millions of deaths happening. It was not all quiet on the Eastern Front. But this is a social movement happening, right? Now, Save the Children Fund and Pope Benedict XV was clear on this. Into secularity, this is for all children, and not simply children of all faiths, and children of no faith as well. It was an amazing moment. Now, I could talk to you also about the World War II, and this is something I'm researching now in the New Vatican Archives. Well, 1943, the foundation of what became Catholic Relief Services. At the time, it was known as War Relief Services. But 1943, this is a process of emergency relief that became long-term sustained global development. And this rebuilding and reconstruction is happening during the war, right? Before the war is over, 1943. So war and peace as interrelated processes, and peace building begins during the war. Now, through the 20th century, Martin Luther King Jr., the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the Civil Rights Movement, laudable for social justice, but we cannot, the Civil Rights Movement, we historically distort Dr. King if we omit the Christian part of that. Love your enemy, turn the other cheek, Dr. King's Christianity. But this is way beyond Christianity. Love as a concept. Hannah Arendt, her 1929 dissertation at the University of Heidelberg is on St. Augustine's conception of love. Hannah Arendt, trying to think through the horrors of the 20th century, for to Arendt. Or at one of the most horrific places on earth, Auschwitz-Birkenau. Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, an incredibly small book, highly recommended if you haven't read it. But logotherapy, trying to make sense of events that are outside of your control, and at the most horrific places of man's inhumanity to man. This is what love is, what Frankl came up with the solution for him, trying to search for meaning. Now, that's the 20th century. Now, love, the second point is that love is the counter to online hate in our digital anomie, in this algorithmic world that we live in, especially in our personal relations, but also in public and into the political. We have to get away from this kind of Carl Schmitt, the concept of the political, destroy your political enemies. Love, personal relations, encountering other people and trying to get to know them, right? Finding common ground. This is where peace building starts. Now, again, it may seem like I may seem delusional to talk about this in the time of people are asking, is Donald Trump equivalent to Adolf Hitler? We could certainly talk about that in the comments. I don't want to address it now, but I teach a class at Trinity on fascism, 1914 to the present. Love in times of extreme hate. These are difficult things, right? But no one ever said love was easy. It's at the core of our humanity. Now, the final point that I'll make is talking about love of truth and the search for truth. This can help us to discover and rediscover our humanity and what it means to be human in the age of AI, with love as the central emotional reality. And here, Pope Leo XIV has this amazing new encyclical, Magnificat Humanitas. If you haven't read it, do. It's amazing. And Pope Leo XIV is a symbolic counterbalance to Trump. Leadership, he is stepping up in the world. It's amazing. So whether you're religious or not, look to Pope Leo's manifesto. And it's subtitled on Safeguarding Humanity in this digital age of AI. It's really an amazing document. But Pope Leo, about peace and truth and being open to criticism, he says, criticize me truthfully. He's open to that. But it's a remarkable document that doesn't demonize or idolize AI. And it's talking about chains of responsibility, and we need humanists to set limits on this. So it's a very intelligent document, and talks about building a quote-unquote civilization of love. This is a phrase from the document. But importantly, it's about a preferential option for the most vulnerable, the poorest, and this is explicitly a theme that comes through the encyclical, a preferential option for the poor and the most vulnerable, safeguarding human dignity in particular. And this is where it really gets universalistic beyond Catholicism, because we come back to human rights as human dignity. And this Human dignity unifies a lot of human rights, diverse human rights theory, from Jürgen Habermas, recently deceased, to Martha Nussbaum and others, coming back to dignity, and human dignity in particular. Now, universities have a role in this. I'm at the end of my time, so I want to bring things to a close by talking about universities will have a role in this in the age of AI. And this forum, this festival, is really interesting, too, for bringing people together in person. Well, universities, the core of that is interacting one-on-one and having to civilly defend your views with facts and encountering opposition, yet persisting in some kind of community. So from these interpersonal bonds spring social movements and transformation. Now, I'll close by saying what's my own historical verdict of what time we're in. Well, civilization is transforming, right? We're constantly in this process of transformation, but is our moment a moment of collapse? I don't know. Too soon to say, right? But empire and democracy, is empire the normative rule in history and democracy the exception? We can go long term on this, and we can have that debate perhaps in the comments. But we have to strive to renew democracy, and wherever possible, defend it. It's more precious, and we need more people, more advocacy for democracy rather than less, I would argue. So I'll close by saying that we live in what history may consider to be a dark episode, or maybe even a dark age. But I hope this era contains the seeds for a future renaissance. And I think love can help us to rebuild our civilization and explore what it means to be truly human. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I asked for some hope, and I think we got some. Kate.
Yeah, I'll try to give you some hope as well. It would be hard to feel hopeful after listening to Dex's opening presentation this morning. He did a fantastic job, I think, of describing the crisis that we're in. But the story of that crisis is the story of inequality. And that is a thread that has been running through the day. And all of my work with Richard Wilkinson, who's also here with me today, has been about the impact of inequality, the way in which it undermines our health and our social cohesion, and increasingly we see the environment as well. But you gave us Tina Turner. I'm going to give you a little bit of Shakespeare, because I'm an academic, it's a bit more old school. Apparently, there is a tide in the affairs of men which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. And I don't think he was talking about riches there. I think he was talking about actually a good society. And I think there is an impending crisis. And I think we are perhaps in for some turbulent times. But I also think there's an increasing number of people who get this. That's happening at international level. So there is a new intergovernmental panel on inequality, which aims to do for governments across the world what the IPCC has done on climate change, make them pay attention, make them look at the trends, make them understand its priorities. There's a roadmap at the UN for eradicating poverty, but also doing that without relying on economic growth, which threatens climate change. And there's a high-level panel which just reported to the UN on what we should be doing to come up with international global goals for the next decade or so. So all these things look hopeful to me because they're understanding the inequality problem. And the priority setting exercise for the new international panel on inequality, the number one impact of inequality that it will focus on over the next couple of years is its impact on democracy and how inequality is undermining our democracy in different countries, in different places, across the world. And so I think those are hopeful things. We've been told all day that democracy is looking a little threatened, that it's feeling stressed. But of course, we're told all the time, aren't we? And I suppose most of us believe that we're living in a democracy. But most of us feel, don't we, that decisions are made by people who don't know us. They don't know our concerns. They don't know our neighborhoods. And so we blame institutions, councils, the NHS, for problems that are affecting us, but without feeling we know how to take action on that, without feeling we've got any agency. And so if democracy is going to survive, then it has to be more inclusive, but it has to be more deliberative, and it has to be more effective, and it needs to be based on bringing people together to talk about things in a thoughtful way. And I was interested that the panel were talking a lot about trust before the break, who they trust and who they don't trust. And we're really talking about institutions. Do we trust the media? Do we trust government? But actually, it's that more generalized trust. Do we trust each other that is probably at the heart of democracy being able to survive in this day and age. So I'm just going to say, I trust all of you. I trust you, and I trust you, and I trust you, and I trust the people who are not in this room today. Because not everybody comes to the Festival of Ideas, Joan. Although, you know, your empire is ever growing. But I trust that if people are selected in some kind of fair, random way to come together and deliberate and listen to experts and look at evidence and deliberate with one another, that they will do that in a respectful way, and that they will do that in a way that can lead to powerful changes and decision making. And that's why in my new book, I'm advocating for citizens' assemblies at all levels, citizens' juries at all levels, local, in our institutions, nationally. In Ireland, 999 citizens met for 5 weekends across 5 short months, and they changed history. Followed by a referendum, which had more than 2/3 in favour, and which the TSOC described as a quiet revolution. Ireland decided to have abortion rights. That was an astonishing change in a very short time through a powerful, deliberative democratic process. They've done the same for legalizing same-sex marriage. And actually, like abortion rights, that was an issue that must have seemed out of sight and out of possibility to them just a few short years before. In France, the Citizens' Assembly was held to develop the details to allow medically assisted dying. And Japan has held city-based citizens' assemblies on climate issues and where recommendations have fed into city plans to reduce their emissions. But Canada leads the way. They've had more than 50 assemblies involving over 500,000 households. And, you know, we've had a few in the UK too, and we could certainly have more of them. In 2020, our government commissioned a climate assembly, which recommended ways to achieve net zero by 2050, including a ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel cars by 2030, and the Labour government adopted that when they came into power. They also said there should be more support for onshore wind farms, and that is also now receiving governmental support. So quite quickly, people power can create policy change and can move politicians. Unlike a jury in a criminal trial, you can do your random selection for a citizens' jury to ensure that you get representation of society in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, geography, or any other characteristic that we might want to make sure is adequately represented. So an assembly could be set up, for example, to ensure that there are enough people of working class background in it, or enough poor people. And the point of a citizens' assembly is to listen with consideration to experts, to evidence before making recommendations. So ideally, even if it's commissioned by government, it needs to be run independently so that the people taking part feel that they have agency to make decisions without thinking about what do the people who set it up really want. So I hope that today, at the end of this session, you feel that you can make an independent, full of your own agency decision about whether you think democracy is a good or bad thing without necessarily feeling influenced by who asked you. And I hope you feel you've had enough evidence through the day as well to really think, is democracy something that should continue? But it isn't the only kind of thing that we could do to do more inclusive, democratic, participative things that give us agency, that help us make decisions to deal with the coming crisis. We could democratically all get together and decide how to spend money. It's called participatory budgeting. It involves members of the public making decisions about how public money is spent. It could be a percentage of a core budget. It could be a specific pot of money for a particular place or a particular issue. And in participatory budgeting, citizens come together again and they deliberate and they think about what they want to spend money on. And then officials take those choices and spend the money in the way that the committees or the groups of people coming together have suggested they do so. And this has been tried and tested all over the world. It proliferated in Brazil, and a really good example comes from the city of Porto Alegre, which in the 90s began to allow its citizens to make choices about spending of public money. And by 1999, they were making annual decisions on how to spend $64 million, a fifth of the city's budget. They've proposed projects that have improved sanitation and transportation and education, and particularly in the poorest areas of the city. And I first learned about participatory budgeting from Dr. Kwan McKenzie, who's a professor of psychiatry. And he favors participatory budgeting, not so much because it's good at spending money or making choices about where money is spent, because of how the process makes people feel. It improves public mental health. It improves civic participation. It strengthens community ties. So when democracy is working really well, it doesn't just give us good outcomes and good results. We spend the money on a good public service, or we make a good collective decision on whether to have abortion rights or same-sex marriage or something else. It makes us feel stronger. It makes us feel more connected. It makes us feel as if we have the agency. And once we all start being active citizens, there's no stopping us, actually, because there's a lot of us, and there aren't that many tech bros. There's a lot of us, and there aren't that many people in government. So, we really can make a difference. I could go on, but I won't. There are things like the public commissioning of journalism we could do. Citizens' assemblies and participatory budgeting, they're just two things that we could do at pace and at scale. But we need to get cracking with this, don't we? We need to create a better society, a more democratic world where we cooperate and respect different points of view. And we're doing that today. Every one of you here today, you're contributing to a good society. So thank you so much for coming and for listening to people like us, because you are really part of making a better society when you are an active citizen. Is democracy too flawed to save? It's probably too early to tell, because it is going to face a major crisis, but I think we just need to get started as soon as we can with more of this. And I do trust you all, I promise.
Brilliant. So, Gavin, the last word for now is with you. I was at a conference just before Christmas where the head of the overarching higher education body in America was talking about, fairly obviously, some of the impacts. But he made a really interesting observation that it's very hard to hate what you seek to become close to, that the more you take yourself into those uncomfortable spaces. So we've talked about activism, we've talked about love, including Tina Turner, which I was not expecting, and we've talked about citizen collective action. What do we as individuals need to think and do to kind of respond to the environment we're finding our way through?
Yes, I think that's the key question, because we have personal responsibility, we have voting rights for now, and we should ask ourselves, what can I do? But I think we also should be aware of two things. One is a public thing, which is democracy's in danger for various reasons, and the other is a private thing, that everybody in this room is attention poor, including me. We are deluged by stuff. We're deluged by information, misinformation and disinformation. And this is not simply an accident, and it's not simply because spend a lot of time on our phones. it is also a deliberate political strategy by some people. And one of them is Steve Bannon, an American advisor, who said, our enemy isn't the Democrats, it's the media, and we have to flood the zone with, he used a word for excrement. And so there's so much stuff that is deluged upon us, and it's very difficult as individuals, and done deliberately, as well as the stuff that's done just as clickbait to make you buy things. And it's inevitable that we're going to be attention poor. And I keep thinking of that great American motto, "In God we trust." And I think of actually a slightly, in my view, better iteration of that from the unofficial motto of the Los Angeles Police Department I came across when I spent some time filming civil disturbances in Los Angeles. And the unofficial motto was, "In God we trust, everyone else we check out." That's our responsibility. But the problem, that's the opportunity and the responsibility. The problem, it seems to me, is because we're attention poor. And let me just do a little experiment to prove it, or at least quote an experiment. There's a chap called, the Finnish chap who's involved with Linux and some other software and stuff. He called Mikko Hyppönen. And he did a little experiment in the City of London. He put up, and this was done with the approval of Europol, among other things. He put up some posters which offered free Wi-Fi for 3 months, and all you had to do was give your contact details and tick the box that says, "I accept the terms and conditions," and he got some people to do it. Within the terms and conditions was what he called the Herod Clause. And the Herod Clause is that in return for free Wi-Fi, I promise to give my firstborn child for all eternity to the people who are giving me this. Right? Now, that is not enforceable under law. And in fact, there's been a subsequent case about something else which shows that the courts are very aware of this. But put your hands up if you've ever read terms and conditions from beginning to end. You have, sir. All the time? Once. Yes, once. Yeah. I did it once. And I counted. Did you do it more than once? Yeah. Did you? Well, I've been Googling how long terms and conditions are. They're on average 30,000 words. That's longer than Hamlet, and not as fun. And so generally people don't. But we tick it, and we do it because we are attention poor. We just don't have the time. Now, in our very complicated democracy, where we are deluged by so-called facts, and we were talking about the differences of different types of, there's so much choice. You can read, as the contributor from the Guardian was saying, you read the Guardian, you can get all sorts of other stuff. But in practice, we don't. And in practice, we can't verify some of the stuff that is deluged upon us. And in a way, it's unfair. One other anecdote from my past as a BBC presenter. I don't know if any of you remember that Iceland, not the country, it's not about the invasion. He's not said that one yet. Iceland, the company, was accused by, I can't remember exactly which health organization. They did some tests on some Iceland food, I think it was hamburgers or beef burgers, and they found horse meat in them. Now, and I interviewed the guy. I'm a big fan of Iceland, actually. I think they do quite a good job. And the guy in charge, I said to him, "Did you test for horse meat?" And he said, "No, we didn't test for hedgehog either." And that's a very, it was funny, and actually, as it turned out, the tests were wrong, and Iceland behaved impeccably, in my view, anyway. But he was making a very important point. We can't test for everything. We can't, even stuff that we put into our bodies. So we can't test for stuff we put into our minds either, all the time. And we can look for trusted guides, but back in 2002, Baroness Honora O'Neill, who gave the Reith lectures, talked about the 21st century as being one of a crisis of trust. Now and she's a very brilliant woman who gave some sort of caveats to that, but basically she was saying, we are looking for things to trust. And this was 20 years ago, and things have developed greatly since then, when it's very, very difficult. The RAND Corporation speaks of truth decay and a growing disagreement about objective facts. And I'm going to keep this brief because it'd be interesting to hear some of your views, but just some thoughts about objective facts. On day one of the Trump administration, their PR guy in the White House said it was the best attended inauguration in American history. It wasn't. It wasn't the best watched on TV and so on. Now, you could have done with legitimate political, this is a trivial example, but that's why it's so important. You could have said, the people who voted for Donald Trump are ordinary, hardworking Americans, and they are, many of them, and they voted for Donald Trump knowing he would go to Washington and do certain things, and they can't take days off from work in Texas and Ohio and various other places to go to Washington to watch this. You could have said that. Of course they didn't. They didn't say that. They said it was the best attended. And when they were cornered with it, one of the other spokespeople said, there are alternative facts. Now, once you start going down that road, and once any of us goes down that road, we are in really serious trouble. And I think that is part of it. And just one final thing. In an attention-poor world, Steve Bannon's flood the zone with excrement, although that's not the word he used. For all of us, the question is, who are you going to pay attention to? Not just what are you going to pay attention to, who are you? You're going to pay attention to the leader of your country, the President of the United States, and so on. But how do they get your attention? And in my view, the President of the United States is a genius at this. Every day he is on various social media telling us that it's Venezuela or it's Greenland or it's, I don't know, the Isle of Wight or wherever it is that's in trouble, or the war is on, or the tariffs are on, or the tariffs are off. It's very, very difficult to keep up. And I think his particular genius is to do that, and other people are doing it too. And just to give you one final example, during the presidential campaign on television, when he was in what's called a television debate, but it's not a debate that any of us would recognize as a debate, frankly. He made brilliantly, I thought, he suddenly, in the middle of, I can't remember what the question was, but he said, you know, they're eating the cats and dogs in Ohio, those people that came over here, talking about migrants. Do you remember that? It was quite astonishing. Now, what's interesting about that, in an attention-poor world where we're deluged by facts, in a democratic election, we all remember that. Do you remember his top 10 pledges about what to do with, I don't know, whatever? It's very difficult. That is a kind of genius. And the fact that immediately afterwards, the mayor of the town that it was involved and the police chief said there's no evidence of this. They couldn't prove a negative, but there's no evidence of this. And that is the core of populism. Populism is to grab your attention in an attention-poor world, and once that happens, democracy is in real trouble. And if you don't think it can happen here, it just so happens that, I was going to say someone who sometimes appears to be Trump's mini-me over here, Nigel Farage appeared on LBC Radio and said, they're eating the swans in the royal parks. Does anybody remember that one? It grabbed the attention. Now, the Royal Park said, we have had no reports of anyone, taking swans from the Royal Parks, but it is a kind of genius. It cuts through. And so therefore, to go back to what I was saying at the start, in God we trust, everyone else we check out. It's very difficult to check out anybody in a democracy when you're deluged by stuff. Much of it is Steve Bannon's excrement. There we go.
So, since you've all been quoting musicians and Shakespeare, I'm a rabid Leonard Cohen fan, and one of the ones I use quite a lot is from the song Anthem. There's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in. So in all of this turbulence, in all of this uncertainty, in all of this deluge of information of varying degrees of veracity, is there any sense of this is a recalibration because of the intersection of the individual, the political, and the technology, all crashing into one another, and somehow, a bit like the Industrial Revolution in the 1860s and 70s, there will be a way forward, and that are we catastrophizing too much the impacts of all of these things together? Alexander.
It's been kind of surprising to me, actually, that we've heard so much about democracy and technology, but not a lot about whether democracy actually is able to survive Reagan-Thatcher capitalism market capitalism, which is where a lot of the first cracks that we're experiencing today kind of came in. And so...
Are we reaching end-stage democracy rather than end-stage capitalism?
Well, this is why I think, the point of my own anecdote that I mentioned earlier was that inequality makes it really, really difficult to remain in proximity with other people, but it gives you enormous proximity to power. The proximity that we should all have to our government is then occupied by people with enormous amounts of money. And so if there's going to be light that filters back through the crack and makes democracy something that's able to survive both the excesses of particularly American market capitalism and the ways that AI in particular, but all technology is really upending our ability to relate with each other and to relate to our societies and governments, I think it's really going to hinge on whether or not we are able to rein in, not just for the purposes of having, of social justice and saying, should a society produce somebody with so many resources that vastly outstrips the resources that other people have when other people lack access to basic things, but viewing extreme levels of inequality and wealth as a basic incompatibility with democracy's functioning, which it really is if you look at the ability of somebody with 100 billion, 200 billion, even $800 billion to weigh in on the functioning of that democracy. So I think that that's really the major thing that we have to tackle. And if we are able to tackle inequality, if we're able to tackle that imbalance, then suddenly the door will really open up to addressing lots of these other issues that are major, major challenges.
Patrick, Pope Leo's comment, his very blunt comment that the world is being held to ransom by a handful of tyrants, was interesting in that he was so blunt about it. But do you think the people he was addressing that to are remotely worried, and he can't do everything on his own, but obviously the intersection of economic policy and trade deals and offers of technology seem to be constraining any other political leaders from being as blunt as they might be. What's the kind of way forward in your view?
Sure, it's one of the pressing questions of our time, and I like the way you put it. Well, Pope Leo, right, I mean, he gives a symbol of hope, right, and hope is, after all, a theological virtue, right, but he actually lives it. I mean, he's saying, be not afraid, like, we have to embrace the technology, you can't avoid it, it's the world we live in, so we have to meet people where they're at now, but we have to try to understand it, and we have to try to set limits on it, right, and so but he's trying to set limits, especially from the Silicon Valley, tech bros, right, embracing this as the new god, and the question of, like, how much are they actually going to pay attention to him or whatnot. I don't know. I don't know, too soon to say, but who knows, through the influence that it's starting to have both, well, obviously anthropic, but also, other. Morality is back on the table now, I think, which is an interesting sign, and regardless of the religious implications for that, this is universal, secular, like the morality of this is back on the table, which I consider a huge plus. And quite frankly, the other thing that inspires me and gives me hope is that Leo is a symbol of some of the good things about the American experiment, especially in this year, 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, right? Leo as, his heritage, multiracial background, and ultimately being the leader of a church that does not put its ultimate faith in borders and outreach to the poorest, the most vulnerable. This is an amazing time, and quite frankly shows up the hypocrisy of exclusive, hard border, white Christian nationalism. I think it's an incredible moment, and he refuses to be co-opted. This has put a universalistic message on the table. Pope Leo was asked to be in America, because he's American, right, for this July 4th, and he said he'd decline that. Where will he be this July 4th? On the island of Lampedusa, where people are still, dying, trying to get across the sea. I think that's a very powerful message, and so look to Lampedusa this 4th of July.
Okay, Kate, your new job title and the work that you're doing on the UN equivalent of the IGCC on inequality, do you see any opportunities for leadership to challenge the current oligarchy of technologists, and how that intersects with individual community action?
That's quite a difficult question to unpick, really. What I see there is really a strong confluence of evidence that's being collected and collated and understood better about the kinds of changes to economic systems that we need. Because if we do have a major economic crash, or we do have a major climate catastrophe, or we do have another pandemic, et cetera, that there's a lot going on at that sort of level, lining up the solutions that we need. There's the leadership of some countries. So that international panel on inequality is being sponsored at the moment by South Africa, Spain, Brazil, and Norway, which is very nice of them, but there are 193 countries, I think, in the UN, and we actually need more of them to be saying, yes, we will get behind this and we will fund it properly and give the panel what it needs to do the work it does. So I think there's leadership of some countries and other countries that are really actually not standing up in alliance with one another against some of the forces that are undermining democracy or making inequality more entrenched. And then there are leadership failures in certain places, and there are promising alternative leaders that perhaps we see. But I think really what we need is some way to surface from the public all of our wishes for the world we want to live in. Because I think we're all quite sensible. And I think we need things like citizens' assemblies and other kinds of deliberative democracy, because I think we are all quite good at thinking about what the world should look like. And when we do that, we don't think it should look like the world we've got. And so all of the mechanisms that help us get from the world we've got to the world we want to be, I think we can rely on the public to provide that leadership, actually. And then maybe some changes to some of the institutions and the mechanisms to help bring that to the fore.
Final question then. Gavin, you've written a lot in previous books on the characteristics of what makes for good leadership. How, and quite often those have been political leaders or leaders of large organizations. Are there things that we as individuals can learn from those characteristics, that if we take on board everything that these three have said, we can go away thinking, I need to be more of X, Y, or Z?
I think that's a very good question. I think all great leaders are great storytellers. They have a narrative, and they have a narrative that makes sense. And so I can't predict how they will tell those stories in the future or what platforms they will be on. But I think we can look back at the great storytellers of the past and see some of the things that they did in moments of great change. For instance, Theodore Roosevelt called out the robber barons of his day. And they were these unbelievably wealthy people, but he did something about it. Henry Ford tarnished his own reputation because he was a genius, rather than like the Elon Musk of his day, and he was an anti-Semite. And he published he bought a newspaper, which was because Twitter wasn't available at the time, which was a horrendous anti-Semitic tract. And he, while his productionizing and getting the cars was a mark of genius, he wasn't infallible. And I sometimes look at some of these tech bros, as they're called, and I think, I met Elon Musk once, and I have to say, this was a while ago, before his current incarnation, does he look happy to you? Does this man, who is going to be worth $1 trillion, look like a happy person? He does not look like a happy person to me. So I think there are flaws there, and there are ways in which these people overreach themselves. Therefore, I think that there is, for whatever political party, there is the possibility of a completely different narrative from someone who can seize the time and say, these are malefactors of great wealth, the Roosevelt phrase, or whatever. These are people we have to bring under control, and that will get people to fall in behind him or her in those kind of statements. So there is a possibility, but I don't know who that person is. And maybe, unfortunately, that person's not yet born, so we've got a long time to go.
Well, maybe on the other hand, it may be somebody sitting in our audience. Okay, so we've talked enough. The floor is yours. The only thing I ask is that you wait for a roving mic, and please ask questions. I guess not just, I mean, these are very expert people and they've been here all day. So I guess I'm interested in reflections and questions, but generally speaking, brevity is the soul of blessedness in a festival of ideas, so we can get around as many as possible. And this gentleman here in the purple jumper is who I will come to first.
Thank you. Thank you for a very enjoyable day. A comment on one of the presentations we've just had, and then a wider question. The citizens' assemblies in Ireland that resulted in referendums and changes were to do with two big moral issues, which were enormously divisive in Irish society, which is a predominantly Catholic country, the Irish Republic. And so none of the political parties would touch either of them with the barge pole. But the government was not prepared to have a citizens' assembly on social policy, economic policy, the really big policies that affect the everyday lives of citizens. So I'm not sure that citizens' assemblies are necessarily a way forward for democracy. Secondly, Dex, I think, presented, no offense to any of the speakers, the most challenging presentation of the day. And I think he talked about the enormous speed of change due to AI, and I think the potential for AI in the future, and ended with another future is possible. We're running out of time. And it seemed to me, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit to make the point, but it seemed to me the rest of the day has been talking about reforms that everybody's been banging on about for years. And we are kind of shifting the deck chairs on the Titanic rather than facing up to the challenge that Dex presented us with this morning. I mean, for example, linking to Paul Cartledge's talking about Athenian democracy, the two sort of characteristics there. One was direct democracy. Now, taking Dex's technology point and AI point on board, can we imagine a situation where AI would enable us to have something far closer to direct democracy than we've had so far? We must be able, using fast-speed AI, to respond very quickly to propositions that might be put to us by a government, and therefore create a form of direct democracy. And the other aspect of Athenian democracy was choosing representatives or choosing people for office by lot. Now, the same thing applies there. Could AI select people to govern on our behalf rather than us necessarily electing them? And if the people chosen randomly by AI didn't live up to the job, we could just, AI could say, no, get rid of him and her, because they're not up to it, and bring some people. In other words, it didn't seem to me that there was any really radical attempt to think of what the future might be like and what AI could do to transform that future, rather than, as I say, shifting the chairs on the Titanic.
Okay, we'll take that, and then I know I've got two questions here. So who wants to? Kate, you're straining at the leash.
On the citizens' assemblies and whether or not Ireland just allowed the two that, served it and wouldn't commission others. I don't think we should just be expecting government to arrange citizens' assemblies for us. I think we can be doing it ourselves in neighbourhoods as a way of uncovering what it is that we collectively desire or wish, and then making that known. I think we should have government-commissioned ones as well, but I think we could do it at all levels. On your point about whether AI could do this for us in some mass way, I of course it could actually. It could be used in the ways you suggest. The problem is do we trust it because of who owns it to do things that are to do with improving democracy? And arguably, I think, no, we don't trust it because of who owns it, not because of its technological basis or its logic of its inner workings. We don't trust the people who own it. So I don't think we can use it in those ways until it's in public ownership.
So Gavin, I can see you want to come in, and I'm really interested in Dex's other point about governance systems that transcend borders. So he talked about a scaled-up EU, which I thought was interesting and certainly brave in this country. Come in.
Yeah, actually, I have just a very simple response to both that question and that question, which is, I don't know if any of you know anybody who's applying for jobs recently, or you know any employer who's scrutinizing the people who are applying for jobs. But a friend of mine told me that, because I mentioned to her that I know some people, some students, who are using AI to write their CVs, or whatever it's now called. Perhaps it's called something else now, but they use AI. And she said, but of course we use AI to screen them. So you've got computers telling computers about humans, and I'm not sure that's quite the way that we would like things to go. I can see why you can get rid of some people with it, but are we then going to, I mean, people will game the system, and eventually somebody will turn up, and they might not be the Albert Einstein you think you've got.
It's quite easy to spot. I mean, I have to say, wading through CVs, when you get the same answer to pre-screening questions because they've shoveled it through something or other. And, you know, I suddenly realized after I'd read 4 of them, oh, good God, they're all the same answer because they've just asked the question of whichever. So, you know, we do kind of notice these things. But on the other question...
The idea that both ends of this avoid any human contact beyond the person who's on ChatGPT seems to me something that we should possibly think about and avoid.
And on the scaled-up EU
Well,
question...
if I could just jump in on the radicalness of the vision. I think you're absolutely right, because we have... You know, we talk about progress in terms of GDP growth and technological innovation, and we need to shift the entire language that we're using, right? I think we need to talk about progress in terms of ecological progress. And instead of talking about GDP growth, we need to talk about social well-being and how many relationships we have and how content we are and satisfied we are with our lives. And instead, we're really good at thinking about how to make X do Y, and not at all at reflecting on, should we make X do Y? Is it wise to make X do Y? And this is the problem with AI completely. The whole thing should have been, from the beginning, subject to a very strict regulatory regime that, just like a medicine, I can't just go out onto the street and distribute pills willy-nilly to whoever wants them. If you have a legitimate purpose and you've submitted your algorithm for approval, then maybe you're authorized as a university to use it for this research. But just throwing LLMs out into the wild, extraordinarily irresponsible. Probably technology that maybe should not have ever been created. Should we, brilliant engineering problem, probably to an engineer, to a biotechnologist, could we genetically manipulate human DNA and horse DNA to create a centaur? But maybe that's an interesting question. Should we? Nobody in this room would say we should do that. And so, yes, we need to totally change the terms of the debates that are even being had. I think actually what the Pope can do and what citizens' assemblies can do is that, because the entire system is set up to respond to the incentives that really wealthy people and that really wealthy corporations have, which is all about GDP and technological innovation. And those are potentially not the things that are making life on Earth, and a life that we all want to live.
Brilliant.
Hi, so this question kind of directed towards Alexander, and I could have chosen one French philosopher, especially when you're mentioning the disconnect between, disconnect from reality. So Baudrillard comes to mind, first of all. But someone else who spent a long time in Paris is Karl Marx, of course. Do you think that we are reaching that point of alienation that Marx was talking about? And as an aside, one of Leonard Cohen's last songs said, "You want it darker, we kill the flame."
Yes, I'm very familiar with that song.
I mean, I don't want to monopolize all the time, and I'll pass it down the line, but I do think that maybe there's an inflection point of alienation coming, and maybe, to be even more radical, maybe democracy will regrow in the fertilizer of the ashes of data centers.
One of the themes that came through again and again and earlier, not today, but in sessions last weekend, was this idea we have more of a sense of shared humanity than we sometimes remember. And I wondered, Patrick, in the context of the questions, that idea of the things that we measure, and Kate, you've done work on measuring happiness, how much more, using Gavin's expression about the stories that we tell, how can we get better at telling stories about the positivity of being human and the idea that happiness is something that we should seek after, the conditions to create happiness?
The shared story, shared humanity. Well, I guess it loops back to the previous question in some ways, the alienation question, right? I mean, one of Leo XIV's symbolic gestures with this is in reference to Leo XIII, who in 1891 wrote Rerum Novarum, of new things. And this is the encyclical on the labor question, too, and trying to find a middle ground between the extremes of communism and capitalism, right? So, and with that document, you know, providing, well, across the spectrum of recognizing property rights, but also recognizing trade unions, and trying to find the Aristotelian kind of middle ground, right, between the extremes. And so, yeah, for our new era of alienation, I think this is one of the reasons why this Magnifica Humanitas is the amazing document for this AI age of alienation. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, you wanted a French philosopher potentially. So around the time of Rerum Novarum, there was Léon Bourgois, who wrote a pamphlet called Solidarité, and he was proposing the concept of solidarity as the sort of middle path between laissez-faire capitalism and Marxism. So, sorry.
There's a lady down here.
Thank you very much. I'm Linda. I think, Joan, you've anticipated my question while I was waiting. And it's really about, I do feel what you're saying about citizens' assemblies is very interesting at the local, institutional, and national level. But why stop there? Why can't we have the idea of, at the global level, that we have an assembly, perhaps with expert and representative citizens representing everybody. Now, this is an idea at this stage, but it's one that I feel isn't getting into the discourse very easily anyway. And I also think that it would, in terms of the human discourse, that the Pope and the other elements of that, it would be a very easy way for us to recognize that we have a human relationship, that we have, across, that transcends borders. If we had an assembly at which that level, that in one sense we'd still be citizens of a state and subject to the state, but we'd also the states would in some way be subject to the citizens that would have, if you like, to begin with, in my view, limited powers to things like the international levels. Sorry, I'm sort of confused now. But what I'm wondering is, why stop there in discourse? Why are we not hearing that citizens' assemblies can be above the state? And why not? Because we can work our way through the ways in which the juries, everything work, to a much better place where, instead of self-interest being at the heart of liberal democracy, other interest can be recognised as our own self-interest. If we're not interested in the other, our security is at stake, because we need the other, and we need to have those discourses more commonly debated. Sorry, that's all.
So I think the idea of transnational citizens' assemblies and indeed global citizens' assemblies is an excellent one, and there There have been some transnational citizens' assemblies at EU level, and there is a global climate assembly being set up. These are technologically challenging, but the other point about them is, where do their decisions go? Okay, so what happened with the Irish citizens' assemblies was the Irish government said, we want to have a citizens' assembly on this, and then we will take your recommendations to a referendum, and if more than 2/3 of the population vote for it, then we will, make those changes. With a transnational or global thing, where are you going? Because we don't actually yet have. We haven't got it yet, but we can start to get ready for it, and we could start to bring to the surface the global consensus or the global variation, actually, in the kinds of things that people want and the priorities that they have. Technically challenging at the moment. We have all kinds of global surveys, don't really cover Africa. You get an answer from South Africa and maybe some from Egypt, but everywhere else gets left out. So these are tricky things to do, but of course not beyond human wit to sort those out. And I think, we are going to need increasingly the transnational alliances that Dex was talking about, but also the Canadian Prime Minister also talked about, didn't he? He said we all need to come together to be able to stand up to American authoritarianism. So I think we will move in that direction. Yeah.
There's a question up here.
So what I really want to ask Kate is whether she's put the arguments for participatory budgeting to the Vice-Chancellor, but I want to ask everyone. So I spoke to an American friend of mine after the second Trump election, and he said very much in sorrow, not in anger, I realize I don't understand roughly half my fellow citizens. And I suppose, looking back on the day, the word that I'm slightly surprised hasn't come up is polarization. It comes up a bit, and Gavin mentioned the alternative facts. And we have a degree of polarization now where it's not just that people treat one another not as reasonable people with whom one disagrees, but as enemies. But we have polarization in which people will actually simply dispute normal facts. And that degree of polarization seems to me a worry if one's trying to think about rational deliberation in the case of citizens' assemblies, or if one's trying to think about proximity, because these people don't want to be in proximity with one another, and they certainly don't love each other. So I just wonder, I guess, that it's just an invitation to the panel to ponder whether polarization ought to have come up by now, or whether it's perhaps it's less of a problem than it seems.
The United States is extraordinarily polarized, and people don't want to be around each other. You're completely right. The number of friendships that have ruptured, families that don't speak to each other anymore, and at a certain level you understand, because it's not just a debate about where tax levels should be and what we should be spending the money on. You get down to real core values when you're talking about neo-fascism and techno-authoritarianism and the deep racisms that are driving Trumpism that got him elected. At the same time, I don't know how you get past any of that and actually live together as a society unless you're in proximity with other people. And I think going back to the example of the civil rights movement in the United States, that was its main strategy. It was, we are going to physically be there and put our bodies in front of your violence until you stop, or until a majority of citizens demand that the government intervene and make you stop. I don't know if I see any mass will to that today. I'm not sure, but again, I don't know how you ever correct for that really deep fracture, even more than polarization, that really deep fracture problem without it. And I don't know how you get around the disputed reality, because people really do live in totally different realities. There is a Fox News reality and a reality, and I don't know how you get past that, especially because AI is going to deepen it, because people will put their trust in the response from the AI.
So is a sort of slightly scale up the in-between model between citizens' assemblies on the ground and some meta global thing? I mean, I guess my concern about the global thing is we don't have any of the systems underneath that would do anything other than create more factionalization, particularly around the idea that the West can continue as it is, and the global south can just suck it up. So I guess there's an issue there to start off with. But what I was interested in was 15-minute cities concepts, where you start to create communities where people live, study, work, play within 15 minutes of where they live, where you can, is there a kind of baseline measurement from where Matt's talking about in terms of polarization as it exists now? Is there any evidence that that kind of construct of a community that is multi-functional would make some of those systems percolate into a meaningful global system?
Sure. I mean, maybe it's a particular problem for America because of the history and infrastructure. And I go back to Alexander's comment, yes, of the civil rights movement. This personability is kind of being there actually. That's a motivator for social change, social bonds, and social movements. And I guess this is the quick American history lesson too, right? This is happening before AI and the digital age, right? I mean, Robert Putnam has the book Bowling Alone, right? About the decline of sociability and the lack of these kind of organizations that give people interaction. So this has been a long-term, for a couple of decades now, but I think it's particularly acute in the American case because of the lack of infrastructure too. It's a very big country where most of the people have to drive to get to work. Lack of and it's very, very difficult now to have these more social bonds, and particularly with this kind of the Weberian kind of Calvinist Protestant work ethic that's particularly in America, right? That they live to work, right? Not work to live. This kind of driving economic impulse of capitalism, if you will, right? It's alive. Weberian Calvinism is alive and well in the American kind of work ethic, and it's continuing to the fragmentation, unfortunately.
It's really hard to know, isn't it, what they're going to do with that work ethic when there is no work.
Yeah.
I mean, if your driving sort of national culture is about having a work ethic and there are no jobs, you're going to need a different story. I mean, I do wonder about, as well, when you've got fracture and cohesion and this level of social tension, about the kinds of things that we need to be providing universally, something about universal basic income, as a way of tackling the forthcoming labour crisis that will be induced by AI, among other things. We'll probably have to do it for that reason, but might it also be a balm to some of the social tensions, lack of social cohesion that we have, because everybody will feel that a certain floor is being put beneath their feet, and that they're being given that because they are citizens of this country or residents of this country, and there's a universalism to it. Maybe that goes some way to heal things. So there's a good leadership strategy for somebody who wants to.
I should say I am the co-author of a report that came out recently that assessed the UK's National Industrial Strategy, Future Labour Market Needs, partially to satisfy my own question about whether the future of the country really is to listen to every politician of every flavour, reliant on a vast supply of plumbers and welders, or if in fact it is a slightly more nuanced picture. And in fact, when you look at the priority sectors identified by the government as being the kind of harbinger of prosperity, it in fact says 80% of the roles required will be graduate and postgraduate. But crucially, it will also reside a system scale reboot of how we think about reskilling on an iterative basis that is very different to what universities and further education colleges are equipped to be able to do. So I don't know that I necessarily, in the same way that I think in the Industrial Revolution, you had lots of narratives saying, oh my God, all our jobs are going to disappear. I think other jobs will come through. The question is actually, do we have the systems in place to have the people who can gain advantage? Well, I say that, do we have systems in place to ensure enough people are equipped to be able to live in that new world? And I'm less sure about that. But Gavin, did you want to come in, or shall we go to the next question?
No, I was just contemplating the question of assemblies at any level, whether it's from the UN down to your local assembly, cannot work if we cannot agree what is a fact and what is not a fact.
Yes.
And if we can't agree that, and we can't agree that, we're in real trouble. And we have had,
when Alex Pretty and Rennie Good were shot, we were told various things, various accounts. And I happen to be a Springsteen fan who wrote, "Just don't believe your eyes." Now, when you have got from the official, what you are seeing is not what you're seeing, you're being told officially, you're in real problems. And what happens when we check the facts, the Washington Post fact checker, I can't remember his name, but he was, during the first 4 years of the Trump term and a bit afterwards, he checked facts, and he had a team working with him, Glenn something or other. And he found that in 4 years, there were 30,000 plus misstatements, uncorrected misstatements or untruths. Now, if you work that out and forget the leap year day, that's more than 20 a day, and it increased towards the end of the first term. Now, again, if you can't agree on the facts and your leaders are telling you that the things you think are true are not true because it's something different, which you see is different from what they are saying, we're in real trouble. So any kind of assembly that brings together people who cannot agree on whether if I let this go, it's going to hit the ceiling or hit the floor, we're in real trouble. And I think that is where I am on this. It's not about people and it's not about assemblies. It is about if you cannot actually verify what you are seeing. That is a real problem.
I think there's time for 2 questions, and I'm going to take them together. So that gentleman there and the lady in front. Those are going to be the 2 final questions, and then I'm going to ask you all to reflect on everything that you've heard and to take a vote, and I will explain how that will work. But Ashley.
I like the panel's view on the use of a referendum, a national referendum on a hugely important project such as Brexit. Was it the correct thing to put that to the national body when most of the people, or many of the people, really didn't know what they were voting about? And if it is the correct thing to do, should there be a minimum percentage for change? I think it's been mentioned Ireland was 60-40. From memory, Brexit was about 53-47.
Brilliant. And this lady here, right, well, we're opening up a whole other frame of discussion if we're going to get into Brexit.
Thank you. It's been a really insightful day, so I've got my question written down. And it kind of touches on the last point that Gavin made, but kind of, I suppose, in light of the discussion of people becoming mistrustful of governments and alarmingly leaning towards autocratic rule, as Gen Z become increasingly kind of come away from legacy media, and I would say also other generations too, and become kind of susceptible to mis and disinformation, how do we as a society deal with this issue, and also not just throw it to teachers? I did work as a facilitator for the Guardian Foundation for a couple of years, training students to be ambassadors to tackle mis and disinformation, but that was government funded for a short amount of time. So how do we tackle it, not just for the youth, but also, let's be honest, all generations, we're all susceptible to that. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Referenda.
Well, you could have done some more interesting things with that referendum, couldn't you? I mean, you could have said, you're going to have to answer a series of questions about the EU and get a certain proportion of them right before you're allowed to vote. I mean, we do know that the #1 Google, like the night before, was like, what is the EU? So, but if you'd actually asked people a few basic questions about it and said, you need to be informed.
But we were told it was an advisory referendum, which then became binding. That, to me, is the thing that's bizarre.
And we certainly could have had a threshold different to
and also, it undercut the Scottish referendum 2 years previously, and it also different parts of the United Kingdom voted in different ways. In other words, it was a mess.
Yeah, it wasn't well thought out at all.
No, but it's not even the mess. The mess is bad enough, but to take something that's advisory and then make it effectively mandatory based on actually not really knowing what you're doing, which is what we had, is quite unacceptable. And it's not surprising that 40% of us don't vote, because that is a real slap in the face for those of us who actually believe in representative democracy.
For instance, the Citizens Convention on Climate, which had kind of the opposite problem, and I observed it and reported on it, and it was strictly advisory. It was held through this third quasi-legislative body called the Ecological, Economic, and Social Council. And then people afterwards there was a lot of upset among certain quarters of French politics that not all of the propositions that came out of the convention were undertaken by the government. And so I think that the idea of referendums and assemblies is interesting because it exposes us all to the ways that institutions work. We really have to have, I think, clear expectations around them because in both of these cases, there was popular miscontent. And it made way more sense to treat something as advisory when it's a group of random people and not people who have been elected to anything. But
well, and
what can be done in schools to get children used to working together and to have run referenda so they would eventually get used to exercising their attitudes and opinions in a responsible way. I think that would be a good thing.
That segues very nicely into this lady's question. And actually, we did some work with Alina Varascu from the Guardian Foundation, where actually the younger you were, the better you were at distinguishing facts from fiction, which I thought was really interesting. But who wants to pick up on that question?
Well, responding to the education point too, I think that's where we have to get back to, especially one-on-one human interaction. And ultimately too, where, well, the universities, I think at that level too, can give people a, how should we say, discerning taste for encountering wrong information. And this kind of curated knowledge will become increasingly valuable in our AI world. And this is, well, the encyclical talks about this too, but the role of education is absolutely key in this. And it's not only university level, it's really getting early on, and especially the one-on-one interaction where you talk to your students, and a dynamic interactive process too, where you're learning from each other ideas, the human minds in real time. This is absolutely key.
So we're going to throw up two questions. I'm reliant on my very fabulous AV colleague at the top right. Okay, so you have two cards, but before you start waving your cards around, I am going to ask each of the panel for one sentence on whether whether effectively you feel there is hope for democracy, in order to segue back to the audience to invite them to vote, to answer the questions: has democracy outlived its usefulness, or is democracy our only hope? I'm going to start at the end of the panel with Gavin.
Hope.
I think we can enrich our democracy to serve us better.
Hope, quoting Abraham Lincoln in this year: "We shall nobly save or meanly lose this last best hope of earth."
Even better than Tina Turner.
And I'm left with the cynical quote from Winston Churchill about how it's the worst form of government except for all the others. But I really think, I really do hope that we can reimagine democracy to respond to all the new challenges.
Well, the theme of the festival is place and space. I hope today that we have given you the place to encounter each other and talk to each other, and the space to think about the things, about the world that we're living in and what kind of world we want to live in. And I'm going to now ask you to raise your cards and tell us what you think.
Oh, that's more green than I thought.
I can be too.
I was ready for a sea of red.
I have to tell you, I think you're both hopeful and very optimistic, and I'm very grateful.
Wait. We preserve it. Historical evidence.
I was going to say, could you all keep it up?
Here, hold on. Okay, hold on. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Okay.
Thank you all so much. I guess it's the, I am a perpetual hopeful optimist with a side order of pragmatism most of the time, and I feel this has been a very enlivening, enriching day, and it has been all of those things, not least of which because of our amazing speakers, and I think we did manage to inject some hope. I'm kind of wondering what would have happened if we'd asked you just after Dex had spoken and before you'd heard anything else. Let's not go there. I want to thank all of our speakers, but I also want to thank all of our audiences, and I especially want to thank our incredible, long-standing sponsors the JB Morrell Trust, because you are just amazing in letting us delve in a very imaginative way through the realms of what you most care about. And toleration, I was very pleased to see, came up in a number of dimensions of today, and I thought that was really fantastic. So thank you all so much for being here. But for now, let me thank all of our speakers as we have explored and decided that democracy is both worth saving and will provide some hope. And thank you so much to all of you.